Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 16. Part 3, The Patriarchal Narratives, Genesis 12:36. The Patriarchal Narratives, Genesis 12:36, form the heart of the book of Genesis, chronicling the lives of Abraham, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, the foundational figures of Israel's identity as God's chosen people. These chapters transition from the universal history of Genesis 1:11 to a particular focus on the family through which God establishes a covenant to bless all the families of the earth, Genesis 12:3. Structured around the Toledo, generations, formula, the narratives trace the divine promises of land, descendants, and blessing, despite challenges like barrenness, conflict, and human frailty. The stories of Abraham, Genesis 12:25, Isaac, Genesis 25:27, and Jacob, Genesis 25:36, along with their families, are rich in theological depth, literary artistry, and cultural resonance, addressing themes of faith, covenant, divine providence, and human responsibility. Rooted in the ancient Near Eastern context and shaped by the exilic experience, these narratives provide the theological and historical groundwork for the Torah's later books, Exodus, Deuteronomy, influencing Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture. This explanation is divided into key points that explore the narrative structure, major episodes, themes, contexts, interpretations, and impact. 1. Overview and structure of the patriarchal narratives. The patriarchal narratives span Genesis 12:36, organized by the Toledo formula, which structures Genesis into genealogical and narrative sections. This part focuses on the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with their families, as the recipients of God's covenantal promises. The narratives are both episodic and cohesive, weaving stories of faith, conflict, and divine intervention into a unified arc that prepares for Israel's emergence as a nation. Structural framework. Abraham cycle, Genesis 11:27-25:11 introduced by the Toledo of Tra, Genesis 11:27. This cycle focuses on Abraham's call, covenant, and trials, culminating in his death and burial. Key episodes include his migration, Genesis 12:1-9, covenant with God, Genesis 15:17, Sarah's barrenness and Hagar's role, Genesis 16:21, the binding of Isaac, Akedah, Genesis 22, and Sarah's death and burial, Genesis 23. Isaac and Ishmael transition, Genesis 25:12-18 The Toledo of Ishmael, Genesis 25:12, briefly outlines his descendants, serving as a transition to Isaac's story and affirming God's promise to Ishmael, Genesis 17:20. Isaac and Jacob cycle, Genesis 25:19-35:29 introduced by the Toledo of Isaac, Genesis 25:19. This cycle primarily focuses on Jacob, with Isaac as a secondary figure. It includes Isaac's blessing of Jacob, Genesis 27, Jacob's deception and flight, Genesis 27:28. His sojourn with Laban, Genesis 29:31, reconciliation with Esau, Genesis 32:33, and his renaming as Israel, Genesis 32:22-32. Isaac's death, Genesis 35:27-29, concludes this section. Esau's descendants, Genesis 36. The Toledo of Esau, Genesis 36:1, lists his descendants and the Edomite kings, contrasting with Jacob's line and fulfilling God's promise to Esau, Genesis 25:23. Literary features. The Toledo formula, for example, Genesis 11:27, 25 hours 12 minutes, 25 hours 19 minutes, 36:1, provides narrative cohesion, linking generations and emphasizing divine continuity. It transitions from universal, Genesis 1:11, to particular, Genesis 12:50, histories, framing the patriarchs as God's chosen line. The narratives blend episodic storytelling with thematic unity, using recurring motifs like divine promises, land, descendants, blessing, sibling rivalry, Ishmael/Isaac, Jacob/Esau, and divine encounters, for example, Genesis 15:1, 28:12-15. Repetitive patterns, such as wife-sister stories, Genesis 12:10-20, 21:18, 26:6-11, reinforce theological points. Vivid imagery, for example, Jacob's ladder, Genesis 28 hours 12 minutes, the Akedah, Genesis 22, and dialogue, for example, Abraham's negotiation, Genesis 18:22-33, enhance emotional and theological impact, suited for oral tradition. Theological arc. The narratives center on God's covenantal relationship with the patriarchs, promising land, Canaan, descendants, a great nation, and blessing, for all nations. These promises face obstacles, barrenness, famine, conflict, but are fulfilled through divine providence, affirming God's faithfulness. The patriarchs' faith, flaws, and growth, for example, Abraham's trust, Genesis 15:6, Jacob's transformation, Genesis 32:22-32, model human-divine partnership, setting the stage for Israel's covenantal identity in the Torah. Two major episodes and narratives. The patriarchal narratives are composed of key episodes that highlight the patriarchs' lives, their covenantal roles, and the challenges they face. Each cycle, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, contributes to the theological and narrative progression. Abraham's cycle, Genesis 11:27-25:11. Call and migration, Genesis 12:19. God calls Abram to leave Haran for Canaan, promising land, descendants, and blessing, Genesis 12:13. Abram's obedience, building altars in Canaan, establishes his faith, though his sojourn in Egypt, Genesis 12:10-20, reveals human frailty in the wife-sister ruse. Lot's separation and rescue, Genesis 13:14. Abram and Lot separate due to land disputes, with Abram generously offering Lot the choice of land, Genesis 13. Abram later rescues Lot from captivity, Genesis 14, encountering Melchizedek, a mysterious priest king who blesses him, Genesis 14:18-20. Covenant and faith, Genesis 15:17. God formalizes the covenant, promising descendants despite Sarai's barrenness, Genesis 15:16. The covenant between the pieces, Genesis 15:7-21, affirms the land promise, while Genesis 17 introduces circumcision as the covenant's sign and renames Abram/Abraham and Sarai/Sarah, signaling their new roles. Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 16:21. Sarai's barrenness leads to Hagar bearing Ishmael, Genesis 16, causing family tension. After Isaac's birth, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, Genesis 21:8-21, but God promises to make Ishmael a great nation, affirming divine care for all. Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18:19. God reveals plans to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, prompting Abraham's intercession, Genesis 18:22-33. Lot's escape and the city's destruction highlight divine justice and mercy, with Lot's daughter's actions, Genesis 19:30-38, explaining Moab and Ammon's origins. Binding of Isaac, Akedah, Genesis 22. God tests Abraham by commanding Isaac's sacrifice, which Abraham obeys, only for God to provide a ram, Genesis 22:1-19. This climactic episode underscores Abraham's faith and God's provision, a cornerstone of Jewish theology. Sarah's death and burial, Genesis 23. Abraham purchases the cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah, securing a foothold in Canaan and affirming the land promise. Isaac's marriage and Abraham's death, Genesis 24:25-11. Abraham ensures Isaac marries Rebekah, a relative from Haran, Genesis 24, securing the covenantal line. Abraham dies at 175, buried beside Sarah, Genesis 25:7-11. Isaac and Ishmael transition, Genesis 25:12-18. The Toledo of Ishmael lists his 12 sons, fulfilling God's promise, Genesis 17:20. Ishmael's death at 137 concludes his story, contrasting with Isaac's covenantal role. Isaac and Jacob's cycle, Genesis 25:19-35:29. Isaac's family and Rebekah's barrenness, Genesis 25:19-34. Rebekah's barrenness is resolved with the birth of Esau and Jacob, with God declaring the elder shall serve the younger, Genesis 25:23. Esau's sale of his birthright to Jacob, Genesis 25:29-34, foreshadows their rivalry. Isaac's sojourn and blessing, Genesis 26. Isaac prospers in Gerar, echoing Abraham's wife-sister story, Genesis 26:6-11. God renews the covenantal promises, Genesis 26:3-5, and Isaac's peace with Abimelech, Genesis 26:26-31, highlights divine favor. Jacob's deception and flight, Genesis 27:28. Jacob, with Rebekah's help, deceives Isaac to receive the blessing intended for Esau, Genesis 27. Fleeing Esau's wrath, Jacob encounters God at Bethel in a dream of a ladder to heaven, Genesis 28:10-22, where God reaffirms the covenant. Jacob and Laban, Genesis 29:31. Jacob marries Leah and Rachel after serving Laban, bearing 12 sons and a daughter, Genesis 29:30. His prosperity and eventual escape from Laban, Genesis 31, demonstrate divine protection, culminating in a treaty with Laban, Genesis 31:44-54. Jacob's transformation and reconciliation, Genesis 32:33. Jacob wrestles with a divine figure, receiving the name Israel, he strives with God Genesis 32:22-32. He reconciles with Esau, Genesis 33, demonstrating personal growth and divine providence. Later events and Isaac's death, Genesis 34:35, the Dinah incident, Genesis 34, and Jacob's return to Bethel, Genesis 35:1-15, reaffirm his covenantal role. Rachel's death and Isaac's death at 180, Genesis 35:16-29, conclude this cycle. Esau's descendants, Genesis 36. The Toledo of Esau lists his sons and the Edomite kings, fulfilling God's promise, Genesis 25:23, and contrasting with Jacob's covenantal line, setting the stage for Joseph's story, Genesis 37:50. 3 Theological themes and significance. The patriarchal narratives establish core theological themes that shape Genesis, the Torah, and Jewish theology, while resonating in interfaith and global contexts. These themes highlight the divine-human relationship and Israel's covenantal identity. Covenant and divine faithfulness. The covenant, initiated with Abraham, Genesis 12:1-3, 15-17, promises land, Canaan, descendants, a great nation, and blessing, for all nations. Repeated to Isaac, Genesis 26:3-5, and Jacob, Genesis 28:13-15, it underscores God's faithfulness, emunah, despite human obstacles. Circumcision, Genesis 17:10-14, and the rainbow, Genesis 9:13, echoed in covenant renewal, are covenantal signs, linking the patriarchal narratives to the Mosaic covenant, Exodus 19:24. Cultural impact. The covenant shapes Jewish Brit rituals and liturgy, for example, Brit Milah, and influences Christian and Islamic theology of divine promise, from salvation history to prophetic missions. Faith and obedience. Abraham's faith, he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness, Genesis 15:6, is a model for Jewish emunah, seen in the Akedah, Genesis 22. Isaac's quiet trust, Genesis 26, and Jacob's transformation, Genesis 32, reflect growth in faith despite flaws. The patriarch's obedience, often tested, for example, Abraham's migration, Genesis 12:4, Jacob's return, Genesis 31:3, contrasts with the primeval history's rebellion, Genesis 3:11, preparing for Israel's covenantal obedience, Deuteronomy 30:19-20. Cultural impact. Faith inspires Jewish ethics of trust, Patriarchal, and global religious narratives of devotion, from Musar literature to Christian and Islamic exemplars. Divine providence and mercy. God's providence guides the patriarchs through barrenness, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, famine, Genesis 12:10, 26:1, and conflict, for example, Jacob/Esau, Genesis 33. Divine interventions, E.G., the ram in the Akedah, Genesis 22:13, Jacob's dream, Genesis 28:12, affirm God's care. Mercy tempers judgment, as seen in God's care for Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 21:17-21, Lot, Genesis 19, and Esau, Genesis 33, extending divine compassion beyond the covenantal line. Cultural impact. providence and mercy inform Jewish chaste, loving kindness, and global narratives of divine guidance, from liturgy to secular stories of hope. Human frailty and growth. The patriarch's flaws, Abraham's deception, Genesis 12:13, 22, Isaac's passivity, Genesis 27, Jacob's deceit, Genesis 27:18-29, highlight human imperfection, yet their growth. For example, Abraham's intercession, Genesis 18:22-33, Jacob's reconciliation, Genesis 33, models redemption. Women like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel play active roles, navigating patriarchal constraints to shape the covenantal line, reflecting human agency within divine plans. Cultural impact. Human frailty informs Jewish teshuvah, repentance, and global reflections on moral growth, from psychological studies to literary character arcs. Land and identity. The promise of Canaan, Genesis 12:7, 15-18-21, ties the patriarchs to the land, symbolized by altars, Genesis 12:7, purchases, Genesis 23, and burials, Genesis 25:9-10. This foreshadows Israel's conquest, Joshua, and exilic hope, Ezekiel 37. The patriarch's identity as sojourners, Genesis 23:4, reflects Israel's calling as a distinct people, a theme central to the Torah, for example, Leviticus 20:26. Cultural impact. The land promise shapes Jewish attachment to Israel, seen in Zionism and liturgy, and influences religious and secular discussions of homeland and diaspora. Sibling rivalry and reconciliation. Sibling conflicts, Ishmael/Isaac, Genesis 21, Jacob/Esau, Genesis 25:33, reflect human division but resolve through divine guidance and reconciliation. For example, Genesis 33, foreshadowing Israel's unity, Exodus 19:6. God's care for non-covenantal lines, Ishmael, Esau, affirms divine impartiality, a precursor to universal ethics, for example, Leviticus 19:34. Cultural impact, rivalry and reconciliation inspire Jewish ethics of peace, shalom, and global narratives of conflict resolution, from family therapy to international diplomacy. For historical and cultural context. The patriarchal narratives must be understood within their ancient Near Eastern setting and the likely exilic context of their final composition, which shaped their theological and cultural significance. Ancient Near Eastern parallels. Covenant and migration. The covenant structure, Genesis 15:17, resembles ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal treaties, with God as the sovereign granting land and protection. Abraham's migration, Genesis 12:19, echoes semi-nomadic movements in the Bronze Age, c. 2000–1500 BCE, aligning with Amorite migrations. Family and social norms, stories of barrenness, Genesis 16, 25 hours 21 minutes, and surrogate motherhood, Genesis 16, 30, reflect Mesopotamian practices, for example, Code of Hammurabi, while wife-sister tales, Genesis 12, 20, 26, parallel regional diplomatic strategies. Sibling rivalry, Genesis 25:33, mirrors epic conflicts in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Cultural achievements and conflict. The patriarchs' altars and wells, Genesis 12:7, 26 hours 25 minutes, align with Canaanite cultic practices, but their monotheistic worship distinguishes them. The Sodom narrative, Genesis 18:19, critiques urban corruption, echoing Mesopotamian moral tales. Cultural significance. By engaging ancient Near Eastern motifs, Genesis 12:36 made its theology relatable while asserting Israel's distinct monotheistic identity, critical in a polytheistic world. Bronze Age setting, c. 2000–1500 BCE. The narratives reflect a Middle Bronze Age setting, with references to semi-nomadic life, tribal alliances, Genesis 14, and Canaanite cities, for example, Hebron, Genesis 13:18. Archaeological evidence, like Marie and Nuzi texts, supports practices like adoption, Genesis 15:2-3, and land purchases, Genesis 23. The patriarchs' interactions with Philistines, Genesis 21:32, 26:1, and Arameans, Genesis 31, align with regional dynamics, though some details, for example, early Philistine presence, may reflect later editing. Cultural significance. The Bronze Age setting grounds the narratives in a historical milieu, enhancing their credibility for ancient audiences and informing modern biblical archaeology. Babylonian exile and composition, c. 587–539 BCE. Scholars attribute Genesis 12:36 to a blend of Yahwist, J, Elohist, E, and priestly, P, sources, likely finalized during or after the Babylonian exile. The exilic context shaped the narrative's focus on land, descendants, and divine faithfulness, offering hope to a displaced people. Abraham's migration, Genesis 12, and Jacob's return, Genesis 31:33, mirrored exilic aspirations for restoration, for example, Ezra-Nehemiah, while the covenant's universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, countered Babylonian imperial claims, affirming Israel's God as sovereign. The emphasis on family continuity, for example, genealogies, Genesis 25 hours 12 minutes, 36, reinforced Jewish identity in diaspora, critical for communal cohesion. Cultural significance. The exilic shaping made Genesis 12:36 a text of resilience, unifying Jews through a shared ancestral story, vital in maintaining faith and identity. Oral tradition roots. The narrative's episodic structure, vivid imagery, for example, Jacob's ladder, Genesis 28 hours 12 minutes, and repetitive motifs suggest origins in oral tradition, likely recited in tribal or cultic settings to preserve history and theology. Their transition to written form, possibly during the monarchic, c. 1587 BCE, or exilic period, ensured their preservation. Cultural impact. The oral-to-written development made Genesis 12:36 adaptable, from ancient storytelling to synagogue readings, ensuring its endurance in Jewish culture. 5 Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. The patriarchal narrative's richness has inspired extensive Jewish interpretive traditions, from rabbinic exegesis to mystical theology, deepening their theological and cultural significance and ensuring their relevance across generations. Rabbinic exegesis. Bereshit Rabbah, c. 5th century CE, interprets Abraham's call, Genesis 12:1-3, as a model of faith, with his trials, for example, Akedah, Genesis 22, testing his righteousness, Sadiq. The Midrash views Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel as prophetic figures, shaping the covenantal line, Genesis Rabbah 40:60. The Talmud, for example, Sanhedrin 99b, praises Abraham's intercession, Genesis 18:22-33, as a model of chaste, while Jacob's wrestling, Genesis 32:22-32, symbolizes Israel's spiritual striving. The Akedah is central to Rosh Hashanah liturgy, symbolizing atonement and divine mercy. Rashi, 11th century, explains ambiguities, like Abraham's righteousness, Genesis 15:6, as trust in God, while Ramban, 13th century, sees the patriarchs' lives as prefiguring Israel's history, linking Genesis 12:36 to the Exodus. Cultural impact. Rabbinic interpretations shape Jewish liturgy, for example, Avo prayer, education, for example, Torah study, and ethics, for example, Emunah, ensuring Genesis 12:36's vitality in communal life. Mystical perspectives. The Zohar, 13th century, views the patriarchs as embodying the Sfirat, divine attributes, Abraham as chaste, loving kindness, Isaac as Gevurah, strength, and Jacob as Tiferet, harmony. The Akedah, Genesis 22, is a cosmic unification of divine justice and mercy, while Jacob's ladder, Genesis 28:12, connects heaven and earth. The covenant, Genesis 15:17, is a spiritual bond, renewed through Torah and mitzvot, with the patriarchs' lives as a tikkun, repair, for the primeval history's sins. The land promise, Genesis 12:7, symbolizes the Shekinah's presence. Cultural impact. Mystical readings enrich Jewish spirituality, influencing prayer, meditation, and festivals, appealing to those seeking deeper meaning in Genesis 12:36. Ethical and communal applications. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations inspire Jewish ethics, with Abraham's hospitality, Genesis 18:18, and Jacob's reconciliation, Genesis 33, promoting chaste and shalom. The covenant's universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, encourages outreach, seen in interfaith dialogue. The patriarchs' faith and flaws inform Musar literature, urging personal growth and communal responsibility, while the land promise inspires Zionist aspirations and prayers for Israel. Cultural impact. These interpretations ensure Genesis 12:36's role in Jewish communal life, from ethical teachings to social justice initiatives, reinforcing its cultural vitality. 6. Engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The patriarchal narratives engage ancient Near Eastern traditions, adapting familiar motifs to assert a monotheistic theology, enhancing their historical and cultural significance. Mesopotamian context. The covenant, Genesis 15:17, resembles Mesopotamian treaties, with God as the sovereign granting land and protection, but its monotheistic focus distinguishes it from polytheistic pacts, for example, Assyrian treaties. Abraham's migration, Genesis 12, echoes Amorite movements, grounding the narrative in regional history. Stories like Hagar's surrogacy, Genesis 16, parallel Nuzi adoption contracts, while the Sodom narrative, Genesis 18:19, critiques urban corruption, echoing Babylonian moral tales. Cultural significance. Engaging Mesopotamian motifs made Genesis 12:36 relatable, while its monotheism distinguished Israel's faith, shaping its exilic identity. Canaanite influences. The Patriarch's altars, Genesis 12:7, and encounters with local kings, for example, Abimelech, Genesis 20:26, reflect Canaanite cultic and political practices, but their worship of one god contrasts with Baal worship. The Dinah incident, Genesis 34, critiques Canaanite intermarriage, reinforcing Israel's distinct identity. The land promise, Genesis 12:7, engages Canaanite territorial claims, asserting divine ownership, a theme central to the Torah, for example, Leviticus 25:23. Cultural significance. The engagement with Canaanite motifs positioned Genesis 12:36 as a theological counterpoint, reinforcing Israel's monotheistic identity in its regional context. Egyptian parallels. The wife-sister stories, Genesis 12:10-20, 26:6-11, and famines, Genesis 12:10, reflect Egyptian diplomatic and environmental realities, grounding the narratives in a broader Near Eastern context. Abraham's wealth, Genesis 13:2, and Isaac's prosperity, Genesis 26:12-14, parallel Egyptian economic motifs. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, counters Egyptian imperial ideologies, affirming Israel's God as supreme. Cultural significance. Egyptian parallels made Genesis 12:36 accessible, while its theology distinguished Israel's worldview, enhancing its exilic relevance. Theological innovation. Genesis 12:36's monotheism, covenantal focus, and universal blessing distinguish it from ancient Near Eastern traditions, offering a vision of a chosen people blessing all nations. This innovation shapes the Torah's narrative and theology, linking to the Exodus and Sinai. Cultural impact. This innovation influenced Western religious and ethical traditions, from Jewish law to global human rights, ensuring Genesis 12:36's enduring legacy. 7. Broader cultural and religious impact. The patriarchal narratives have profoundly influenced Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture, shaping religious practices, cultural expressions, and ethical frameworks. Jewish tradition. Genesis 12:36 is central to Jewish theology, liturgy, and ethics, with the patriarchs as models of emunah, chaste, and teshuvah. The Akedah, Genesis 22, is a cornerstone of Rosh Hashanah liturgy, symbolizing faith and atonement, while the covenant shapes Brit rituals and prayers, Avo. The narratives inspire Jewish identity, seen in naming practices, for example, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Zionist aspirations for the land, reflecting Genesis 12:7. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations enrich Torah study and spirituality, ensuring communal vitality. Cultural impact. The narrative's role in Jewish tradition fosters communal cohesion, ethical reflection, and cultural continuity, from synagogue readings to modern Jewish literature. Christianity. Genesis 12:36 shapes Christian theology, with Abraham as the father of faith, Romans 4:16, and the covenant foreshadowing Christ's redemptive role, Galatians 3:16. The Akedah, Genesis 22, is a type of Christ's sacrifice, central to Christian liturgy and art, for example, Caravaggio's paintings. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, informs Christian missions, while the Patriarch's faith inspires ethical teachings on trust and obedience. The narratives appear in lectionaries and sermons, reinforcing salvation history. Cultural impact. The narrative's influence on Christianity shapes Western religious culture, seen in theology, art, and ethics, from medieval cathedrals to modern Christian advocacy. Islam. The Quran echoes Genesis 12:36, with Abraham, Ishaq, Isaac, and Jacob, as prophets exemplifying submission. Islam. The Akedah, Surah As-Safat 37:99-113, emphasizes Ibrahim's obedience, while the covenant's universal scope aligns with Islamic ethics. The narratives influence Islamic storytelling, Qisas al-Anbiya, and ethical teachings, promoting charity and family unity. Abraham's legacy is central to Eid al-Adha, commemorating the Akedah. Cultural impact. Genesis 12:36's influence on Islam fosters shared Abrahamic values, seen in Islamic literature, festivals, and interfaith dialogue, contributing to global religious culture. Global culture. Literature and art. The narratives inspire works like Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, reimagining Jacob's family, Chagall's biblical paintings, and films like The Ten Commandments, 1956, which draw on patriarchal themes. The Akedah and Jacob's ladder are universal motifs in poetry and visual art. Philosophy and ethics. The Patriarch's faith and flaws inform philosophical reflections on freedom and morality, for example, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling on the Akedah, while the covenant's universal blessing shapes human rights and peace-building. Popular media. The narratives appear in children's books, TV series, for example, The Bible, and music, for example, Leonard Cohen's Story of Isaac, ensuring their cultural accessibility. Cultural impact. Genesis 12:36's global influence enriches cultural expression, fostering dialogue on faith, identity, and ethics across diverse media and traditions. 8. Contemporary relevance and applications. The patriarchal narratives remain relevant, addressing modern issues through their themes of faith, covenant, and human responsibility. Interfaith dialogue and peace-building. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, and shared patriarchal figures inspire interfaith initiatives, with Jews, Christians, and Muslims collaborating on peace-building, for example, Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi. The narrative's emphasis on reconciliation, Genesis 33, informs conflict resolution. Cultural impact. The narratives foster mutual understanding, shaping interfaith and diplomatic efforts to promote peace and cooperation. Ethics and social justice. The sanctity of life, Genesis 21:17-21, and hospitality, Genesis 18:18, inform Jewish and global advocacy for human rights, refugee aid, and social equity. The narrative's critique of deceit, Genesis 27, and favoritism, Genesis 37, inspires ethical leadership. Cultural impact. Genesis 12:36 shapes social justice movements, from Jewish tzedakah to secular human rights campaigns, addressing inequality and oppression. Environmental stewardship. The land promise, Genesis 12:7, and the patriarchs' care for creation, for example, wells, Genesis 26:18, inspire Jewish environmental ethics, Baal Tashkit, seen in initiatives like Eco-Jews. The Covenant's universal scope encourages global sustainability efforts. Cultural impact. The narratives inform environmental policies and activism, promoting care for the earth in religious and secular contexts. Identity and multiculturalism. The patriarch's sojourner status, Genesis 23:4, and the Covenant's universal blessing address diaspora and multiculturalism, inspiring Jewish and global reflections on identity and inclusion in pluralistic societies. Cultural impact. Genesis 12:36 fosters dialogue on cultural heritage and diversity, seen in educational programs and cultural festivals. 9. Synthesis. The patriarchal narratives as the Torah's covenantal foundation. The patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12:36, are the covenantal foundation of Genesis and the Torah, transitioning from the primeval history's universal scope to the particular story of Israel's ancestors. Through the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the narratives establish God's covenantal promises, land, descendants, blessing, despite human obstacles, affirming divine faithfulness and human responsibility. Their literary artistry, vivid imagery, repetitive motifs, and dialogic depth, enhances their theological impact, while their ancient Near Eastern roots and exilic shaping ensure historical and cultural relevance. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen their meaning, sustaining their vitality in Jewish tradition, while their universal themes resonate in Christianity, Islam, and global culture. In modern times, Genesis 12:36 addresses interfaith dialogue, social justice, environmental care, and multiculturalism, offering timeless wisdom. As the Torah's narrative bridge, these chapters frame Israel's mission to bless all nations, preparing for the Exodus and Sinai covenants. Overview and structure of the patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12:36. The patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12:36, mark a pivotal shift in the book of Genesis, moving from the universal history of humanity in the primeval history, Genesis 1:11, to the particular story of Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, whose lives and covenantal relationship with God lay the theological and historical foundation for the nation of Israel. These chapters focus on the divine promises of land, Canaan, descendants, a great nation, and blessing, for all nations, articulated in God's call to Abraham, Genesis 12:1-3, and reiterated to Isaac and Jacob. Structured around the Toledo, generations, formula, the narratives weave together episodic stories of faith, conflict, divine intervention, and human frailty into a cohesive arc that prepares for the emergence of Israel as God's chosen people in the later Torah, Exodus, Deuteronomy. The